Scott Kugel, who works on issues of homosexuality in Islam. Okay, fascinating article about the story of Lut and how Ibn Hazm actually interpreted it in a way. I mean, his argument is that the people in the story of Lut, they were being punished not for having homosexual sex, but for homosexual rape. If you go back and read the story, what they did was they raped guests to humiliate them. And so the issue isn't the touching of the wrong genitals to each other, but instead the use of sexuality as violence. Now again, this is controversial, but it's coming from someone who knows the sources really well and is arguing from the sources. And so you do have these progressive movements within Islam. Among that movement, there's also a tendency to emphasize the diversity in Islam, to recognize that there are diverse points of view, and that includes diverse, I hate the word, schools of thought, not sects, you know. Ismailis, Alavis, Bohris, Sunnis, various kinds of madhabs, and that those have to be respected. And also that there are universal human values that are not specifically only Muslim values. I think there's a tendency among the people who call themselves progressive Muslims to say that the ethical and human values that are taught in the Quran are not being taught as things that are only within Islam, but are in fact rooted in our humanity. Oh, I was going to tell you the Quranic story where the egalitarian comes from. You know, at the very beginning, when Adam is created, all of the future generations the Quran describes, and whether you see this as a metaphor or an actual action, I don't think it matters. All the potential human souls are cast out, you know, and spread out across the cosmos, and God says, "Ana lasti rabbikum," right? Am I not your Lord? And we all said yes. Well, there's two things going on there. The first is where people get this notion of reversion rather than conversion, because we're all inherently Muslim, because we've all recognized before we're born, we have a theotropic tendency to turn towards God. But that all those souls before we had names and genders and existence in history, we were all just souls before God. And so if we start thinking we're better in some way than anyone else, that this becomes a violation of a Quranic understanding of the equality of human beings. So that progressive Muslim voice is, I think, becoming an important one. And what's interesting is that those voices tend to be coming, although it's not entirely true, not from traditional ulama, but something that I think is happening in the 21st century that I find really fascinating. That a lot of these voices are coming from people who learned about Islam in the context of universities. It's coming from PhDs, right? Amina Wadud is not an alim, she's a PhD. Omid Safi is not an alim, he's a PhD. Scott Kugel is not an alim, he's a PhD. And that's something Muslims really have to think about, right? If you learn how to read the sources in a university, that's where you learn the language, and so you weren't necessarily learning it in the hawza, as the, you know, in a madrasa situation, you know. Now, again, if we're going to say that Sayyid Qutb has credibility and he didn't learn his stuff in the madrasa, why is it any different if Scott Kugel learns his stuff in a university and other places? Because remember, these people also travel in the Muslim world, study with Muslim teachers as well. I mean, but the idea that people are getting their credibility and their legitimacy from having a university doctorate rather than having some kind of silsila that gives them that authority from a traditional source, I think is something that's happening that's very interesting. Again, I'm not I'm not putting a value judgment on that, but I think it's something we have to really think about. You know, so many of the people who are engaged in the normative study of Islam right now, and who are thinking really interesting ideas, whether they're conservative ideas or progressive ideas, are coming out of the universities rather than out of traditional madrasas. And we should think about what that means in terms of modernity.